Hello everyone, this is João from KenHub and welcome to another tutorial. This time I'm going to be talking about another group of muscles. This time is the deep extensors of your forearm. Now, let me do a quick review and give you an idea of how the dorsal part of the posterior part of your forearm looks like in terms of musculature. It looks something like this. And if we were to remove or strip out that superficial layer that you find there, we can then find the group of muscles that we're going to be talking about today, the deep extensors of the forearm. Now, keep in mind that this is, and as I mentioned, this is a group of muscles that can clearly be seen on the posterior side of the forearm, and they are 5 muscles, and 5 muscles that we're going to be covering throughout this entire tutorial. Now, their bellies and tendons form the surface of the distal forearm and wrist, where they can be easily palpated, especially this group right here that I was pointing at. And we're going to name all of these muscles. Now, in terms of the list that we're going to be covering the supinator, also talking about the abductor pollicis longus. Then we're going to talk about the extensor pollicis brevis, then the extensor pollicis longus, and we're going to end up this tutorial talking about the extensor indices. And without further ado, let's move on to the very first one here on our list, the supinator muscle. That is a relatively broad muscle which is curved around the upper thirds of the radius, as you can see here on both of these images where we highlighted the muscle in green. It functions to supinate, as the name indicates, it supinates the arm. Now let's talk about the origin points of the supinator, and keep in mind this is a relatively complex topic because between references we end up finding a lot of differences, but we try to keep it simple and connect the dots here, so whatever you're learning this from or whatever school you're coming from, you can apply this knowledge. Now, as I mentioned, this muscle has a complex origin tendon, which one part will arise from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, what we call a superficial part, and then another part, a deep part, will then come from the proximal ulna on the olecranon. Now, it also has 2 other origin points that I would like to connect here as well and talk about briefly. One of them is the radial collateral ligament. And another origin point that is also commonly seen between the references is the radial annular ligament. Now that we looked at the origin points of the supinator, it's time to then move on to the insertion points of this muscle. And from the origin point, the muscle will then curl dorsally around the neck of the radius and inserts at the posterior and lateral surface of the radius between the radial tuberosity and insertion of the pronator teres. So this is important information that I believe you should write down and collect in your notes, so when you go into that exam, you know exactly what we're talking about here, about the supinator muscle. Moving on from the supinator muscle to the second one on our list, the abductor pollicis longus. Now, the abductor pollicis longus is also known as one of the extrinsic muscles of the hand, and as the name implies, its major function is to abduct the thumb at the wrist. And you can also see here on this image how it will function in such matter based on its insertion point that we're going to talk about next. Now, in terms of origin points, we're going to look at 3 origin points that need to be learned related to the abductor pollicis longus. The first one is going to happen on the posterior surface of the radius, this bone right about here. And you notice that the abductor pollicis longus will be arising from the radius. Now, the second origin point is going to be the posterior surface of the ulna, as you can also see here on this image. And the third origin point is known as the interosseous membrane. So this membrane that should be found between these two bones, the radius and the ulna, and where this muscle will be also arising from. Moving on to the insertion points of the abductor pollicis longus, there is one origin point or one insertion point that you need to remember, and this is the base of the first metacarpal bone, as you can see right about here. So this base of the thumb, or the metacarpal of the thumb, will serve as the insertion point of the abductor pollicis longus. Now let's move on to the next muscle on our list. This is the extensor pollicis brevis, as you can see here on this image. And this muscle lies on the medial side of, and also closely connected to the other muscle that we talked about before, the abductor pollicis longus. Now, in terms of origin points for the pollicis brevis, we need to remember two origin points for this specific muscle. One that you can see here on this image, one is coming from this bone. If you guess well, yes, this is the radius, and the extensor pollicis brevis will be originating from the posterior surface of the radius. Another origin point comes from this membrane that is attached between the radius and the ulna, and this interosseous membrane will serve also as an origin point for the extensor pollicis brevis. Next point that we need to make about the extensor pollicis brevis is the insertion point. Yes, I said point because there is one that you need to remember, and you can also see here on this image that the muscle is inserting on the base of the proximal phalanx of the thumb, or the base of the first proximal phalanx. It is also important to mention that often the insertion tendon splits into two and additionally attaches to the trapezium. Now that we completed the extensor pollicis brevis, it is time to talk about its cousin, the extensor pollicis longus. And this muscle is much larger than the extensor pollicis brevis, and also its origin is partially covering the previous muscle that we talked about, the extensor pollicis brevis. The extensor pollicis longus also acts to stretch the thumb together with the extensor pollicis brevis. Now, in terms of origin points, there are two origin points that you need to also remember for this muscle. One, it's coming from the opposing bone here. The posterior surface of the ulna is serving as an origin point for the extensor pollicis longus. And as we've seen on the pollicis brevis, we're also seeing an origin point happening on the interosseous membrane for the extensor pollicis longus. Moving on to the insertion points of the extensor pollicis longus, this muscle is going to go all the way to insert now on the distal phalanx of the thumb. So it's going to insert more specifically at the base of the first distal phalanx. Still on the insertion of the extensor pollicis longus, I would like to add a few points. That at its insertion point, it forms a dorsal aponeurosis, which covers the thumb medially, laterally, and also dorsally. This sheet-like tendinous expansion serves mainly as an insertion point for other muscles and ligaments, similar to what we see on the dorsal aponeurosis of the extensor digitorum. It is time for us to move on to the last muscle here on our list for this tutorial, the extensor indicis. And this is a narrow and also elongated muscle found medially to and also parallel with the muscle that we talked about on the previous slides, the extensor pollicis longus. Now, look at the name, extensor indicis. It says it all. So word origin really helps you understand a lot about anatomy in general, and especially when we talk about muscles. So the tendon of the extensor indicis goes to your index finger, which then will help extend it. So that's why we call it extensor indices. So no rocket science here, very simple and straightforward. Now, in terms of origin points, we need to remember two as well for this muscle. One, you can see here on this image, and this is the posterior surface of the ulna, which will serve as an origin point for the extensor indices. Another one is seen on other muscles as well, the interosseous membrane, which will also serve as an origin point for this muscle. Now let's talk about the insertions of, or insertion point for the extensor indices. And yes, there is one that you need to remember, and this is the dorsal aponeurosis of the index finger, or the second finger, as you can see here on this image as well. Throughout this tutorial, we cover the origin points, the insertion points for all the deep extensors of the forearm. Now it's time for us to go over the innervation of these muscles. And all you need to know is that all 5 deep extensors of the forearm are supplied by this nerve here, seen highlighted in green in this image in the center of your screen, the radial nerve. Now also I would like to add that the radial nerve has a superficial branch and of course a deep branch. At the height of the radial head, these 2 branches, or the radial nerve, will divide into these 2 branches. Now, while the superficial branch continues along this muscle here highlighted in green, known as the brachioradialis, the deep branch will then penetrate the supinator muscle and branches off as the interosseous nerve. And the supinator muscle is seen here also highlighted in green in this image on your right. Now, this interosseous nerve is then responsible for the innervation of almost all deep extensors. Related to the supinator muscle, it's important to add that this muscle is the only deep extensor that receives a supply of motor branches directly from the radial nerve. Now, I would like to move